Tonight, we are really excited to have Abigail Collins with us. She teaches digital arts and photography with us at Pepperdine. So it's just extra exciting to have one of our professors talking about their own work with us in this series. Abigail Raphael Collins is an interdisciplinary artist working with video and installation. Her work borrows from documentary, journalistic, and experimental practices to reconsider relationships between media and systemic violence through a queer feminist lens. She received an MFA from UCLA and a BFA from Cooper Union. Recent exhibitions have been at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, the Pasadena Armory, marathon screenings, Angels Gate Cultural Center, Post, TAM, USC Station Gallery, and UCLA. She's the recipient of the Toby Devin Lewis Fellowship, the UCIRA grant, and a former resident of the Seoul Art Space in Seoul Art Space Kwangchon. She was selected as the emerging curator at the Los Angeles Contemporary Archives for an exhibition about silence and resistance. Please join me in welcoming Abigail. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you. And I wanted to say thank you also to everyone for being here. It's a busy point in the semester. There's a pandemic. Who knows what else life is throwing at you. So thank you for taking the time to share with me. I think I've mentioned this to any students that I currently have or have had in the past, but it's been really, I don't want to say surprisingly, but anything in the pandemic is difficult, but getting to see people's work about what's going in the world at a time when primarily we get to see news footage, right? And it's this kind of like sterilized, oversimplified way of reflecting back to us what's going on, and getting to see students' artwork about these difficult times has been so important and so helpful for me to stay reflective, and so inspiring that you all are able to take up that prompt to be creative and to reflect on these really difficult things and share them with me. So I'm glad to get to share some of my work with you because I've felt the generosity of that exchange for the last year. So thank you for being here. As Ty mentioned in my bio, I work mostly with video art, with video installation, sometimes photography, and also some curating. And my work focuses primarily on two things, and that would be intergenerational trauma, so how traumatic events get passed down through generations, and sound. So how those two things interlock, is that what I wanted to say? How those two things overlap really is something that happens in a different way with each project, but it's something that is important with every single project. And it's not something that I really realized was happening until more recently, that it's been a really strong through line. And I think that's one of the great things about being an artist is that you're following these different threads, and it's only maybe 10 years later that you realize like, oh, this has been like a 10-year inquiry into looking at this idea through so many different facets. So we'll talk about that as I show you some specific pieces. I'm going to show you 2 curatorial projects and 3 art pieces. So I'm going to start by the first body of work, or the first works that I'm going to show you are from, so I started them around 2012 and finished them around 2015. So I'm going to read you a little bit, just a few paragraphs that are explaining what I mean by the relationship between intergenerational trauma and sound, specifically as it pertains to this project. Okay. So infrasound is too low, too deep for the human ear to hear. So if you think of ultrasound would be too high for us to hear. It's such a high frequency that it can penetrate, right? Like we have ultrasounds that can be medical. So infrasound is the opposite. It's too low for us to hear. Infrasound is too low, too deep for the human ear to hear. Generated by earthquakes, tsunamis, wind turbines, elephant stampedes, these frequencies deeply affect the body. They send chills and unease. Infrasound is often called the fear frequency. As a phenomenological experience of sound we can't auditorily perceive, it resonates all the same and demands our attention. My sense is that intergenerational trauma works in this way. My mother tells me that as a child, she was terrified of the portrait hanging in her grandparents' bedroom, her great aunt and namesake. She didn't find out until she was adult that that aunt was killed in a concentration camp in Poland. When she tells me this story, she doesn't speak the name they share, lightly skips over it with a pause each time. My mother sensed the resonance of her namesake's portrait, and I sense the resonance in the shared name she doesn't speak. In those gaps, there's a resonance that drives me to listen to sounds below my threshold. Sound travels by vibrating the thing next to it, losing strength as it passes its vibrations from matter to matter. The intergenerational trauma has traveled so far at this point that I strained to hear the violence of World War II, while my grandparents strained not to hear it. The sounds of their stories are now faint enough for me that I'm able to hear other stories simultaneously. I'm able to hear my family's story and the colonization of Palestine as two parts of the same narrative. Israel was created as a Jewish homeland for displaced Jews from World War II, forcibly displacing Palestinians in order to do so. Today in Gaza, Palestinians are ghettoed by a Jewish state created to find refuge from ghettoization. The story echoes itself. So that's a little bit of sort of like my personal bio. My family is Jewish, and both sides have been really dramatically impacted by World War II. And I didn't, I don't think that I started out wanting to address that directly, but I wanted to look at the ways that, I don't know how familiar all of you are with the relationship between Israel and Palestine, but it's been important to me to think about intergenerational trauma in terms of its echoes. And this is one such really like drastic echo, right? Where violence really snowballed into another form of violence in Palestine. And I was able to go there in 2011 and had a very impactful experience being there for a few months. And we'll go back to that in a minute. But one thing that happened when I returned was I wanted to think more about this intergenerational trauma, and I wanted to think more about the ways that my family's trauma was connected to trauma in Palestine. And so I started by just cold calling a trauma center in Gaza. And the person who picked it up, I had a translator with me. It was the middle of the night here. I was planned on calling 15 places because I really wanted to interview people. And the person that picked up that first phone call was named Ala Hamuda, and she spoke totally fluent English. She is a translator, a writer, works at the trauma center, and we actually started a friendship. So we would talk at least once a week for 2 years. And she told me a lot about her family. We really, we talked about everything, but one of the things that was brought up, sorry, dog chorus, was I was asking her lots of questions about drones overhead in Gaza. And I was asking her questions about sight. What did they look like? What did she think about what they saw? And she was like, it's the sound. I can't see them. It's the sound. We call it zanana, which means buzz, right? So she really reframed this question for me that I was coming at it with this sense of sight from this place of thinking about being in the drone's perspective. And she really threw my whole project out the window in such a helpful way that's really helped me with everything that I've done since then in thinking about starting with a question and really attending to the answers. really letting the answers surprise me, derail me, and educate me, which she really did. So this sent me in a whole line of inquiry about sound specifically, and thinking about echoes of trauma in her life through her generations. So she, at the time of the siege in Gaza in 2013, was pregnant. And we talked a lot about the resonant frequency of the womb. We talked about what the child could hear. We talked about the frequency of drones. And we talked a lot about the power of sound in her life. So I am going to put a clip in the chat. But first, actually, in this, the slides that you're seeing. So here's a shot of the installation, a really simple installation, floor to ceiling. And the first thing that you'll see as Ala and I are talking is this shot of the sky. And that is actually something I found on YouTube, which was people in Gaza filming the drones. And as you'll see, you can't see them. And so there's this sense of like looking for something that can't be quite articulated, that is also really related to this sense of intergenerational trauma. There's often these gaps in things that they're untranslatable, they're unarticulable, and in this case, they're invisible. And then this is another thing that you'll see, which is it's a kind of a speaker. It's a contact speaker. And so it only works when you press it against something that has the ability to resonate the frequency. So if you put that little thing on glass, it would turn the glass into a speaker. And so I was experimenting with it with bones and seeing which parts of my body would it turn into a speaker. And I think that's probably all you need to know before watching the clip. Where is the chat? Let's see. Okay. So go ahead and click on that. It's 3 minutes. And I'll see you back in 3 minutes.
It's telling me that the video is private.
And then the password is Allah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, does anyone have any questions? Just even so far? If you do, just shout it out because I can't totally see everyone. So as you could see there, repetition was something that I was really trying to think about, and think about this kind of repetition of violence, and thinking about my position in that repetition. I'm sort of struggling with that. And so another project that I wanted to show you, and I'd love to hear your feedback either after the talk or if any thoughts come up during it. Part of what's so wonderful about giving a talk, especially to students that I've worked with, is getting to hear your thoughts. So please, all thoughts are very welcome. So I wanted to share another project that specifically relates to Palestine, which actually happened before the video with Allah was made. And this was, actually, I think I'll go ahead and read it before we discuss it. So I'm going to go ahead and read these texts here. So the first one says, a flash photo of a large rectangular hole in the ground. Raid and I were walking to his sister's home just outside of Hebron when he stopped suddenly and asked me to take a photo. The flash illuminated our path and I saw the hole, about 10 feet in front of us. I looked at the photo I had just taken of my camera as he told me about the artifacts that had been dug up and confiscated by Israelis earlier that month. The rocks and grass closest to the camera are blown out from the flash, and the far edges of the hole show the details of the dirt that was freshly dug. Another flash photo taken a moment later, just slightly closer and slightly above the hole. It's almost flat at the bottom and still wet. Looks about 12 feet deep. One more flash photo taken in the general direction Raid and I were walking to help light our way so we wouldn't fall into the hole. I looked at the photo on my camera the next morning and realized the path we were walking had been marked by 2 white spray painted lines. I showed it to Raid, who said the lines were tracing a path where Palestinians were allowed to walk to get to their homes on the other side of the Hebron settlements. And then one more. I took this one in the checkpoint at Kalandia in the West Bank. I joined the line in a narrow concrete passageway with fluorescent lights. I held the camera low, thinking no one would see me shooting, and pressed the camera body against my stomach to keep it from shaking. It didn't work and the image is blurry. Anyway, all you can make out on the right side of the frame is a wall of green tinted bulletproof glass and a metal slot so your bags can be taken to the Israeli side to be inspected. Behind the glass is a blur of an IDF soldier. This is the last one I took before the images were confiscated. So I spent another few months there, and and I was advised not to bring any of my footage back with me through the airport because I was searched, and that I should mail it home, which I did, but the package was opened and marked, labeled like we've opened this and inspected it, and the flash drive with all of my footage and photos was removed. And so, there was a sense of loss, but also a real opportunity that opened up to think about first of all, the limits of my understanding, right? Like every time I took a photo of something, if it had writing in Arabic, I didn't know what it meant. So there's also some sense of like real loss, right? And a recognition of what I didn't know and what I could remember. And there was also a sense of relief in a way, because a lot of the images, right? Like if you had just seen an image of a hole in the ground, it wouldn't necessarily portray all of the events that were so built into the kind of systemic violence that I was seeing and experiencing. And so the inability of images to really fully grasp the repetition of this violence was actually kind of a gift in a way, for me to then have to go back and think in terms of maybe a more subtle register, like I mentioned before. Maybe that sense of like listening a little bit more carefully to what I was able to remember, and to think about, in some ways, something that my more recent project deals with too, of a kind of a reaffirmation that the state is really interested in the power of images. This like really, really understands how potent and powerful images can be. And I didn't want to let that just get completely confiscated. I wanted to find a way to bring that potency into the artwork anyway. So that's this project. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you're talking a lot about how the repetition of images, especially within the circumstantial area or time or just place that you were in general over there, really changed like the circumstance overall, because what you're trying to convey through like a repetition of an image was not quite, like you weren't pretty much able to display whatever the repetition of violence was within that culture and that setting. What do you think of the repetition of imagery today within like pop standards of pop cultural standards of like social media and infographics, and just like the overall repetition of like that expelling of like pop cultural feeling in today's, I guess, social media standard?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So, which actually this next slide does get to. So I was in this place of feeling like, so there's an artist that I really love, Basma Al-Sharif, and she's a video artist, but she makes these like almost like sometimes psychedelic, almost dream world explorations. She's from Gaza, and she's, I think, now living in Berlin. Maybe she was living in LA for a while, but she refuses to do a kind of like documentary address of the violence that her family faces, because her feeling is like, this has been over the news. This has been on social media. We've seen these images of bombings, of women crying, like, and of funerals, of teenagers being shot. She's like, it didn't change anything. We've seen this kind of like standardized, representation of violence not work. So she's like, fuck it, I'm making these like explorations of my inner world and how my inner world is affected. I'm going to address and appeal to a different side of my viewers. And so I really appreciated, I don't do that, but I really appreciated her stance. And I really hear her anger. And I think that having witnessed some of that myself and having felt some of that anger, a much different perspective for sure that I come from, but that this repetition of this imagery was not doing what I had hoped, what I hoped it would do, that the images couldn't do enough. I worked with a fellow grad student, Damir Abdajic, to make we curated a show together, and it's called Compassion Fatigue. And the idea was that fatigue of seeing these images again and again and again, that fatigue that you get when you watch the news and your body just can't even register pain anymore. And you don't want to, right? Like there's a way in which it becomes a sea that washes over you, and we can't register the weight of each like each horror. I mean, it's really happening at a fast rate at all times, but the news cycle really speeds it up. And I would say that social media does it too. But I have a different thing to say about social media in a second. But so this compassion fatigue show in some ways was really interesting and successful. So we invited grad students from all over the world to share work that addressed conflict in a way that tried to undermine or subvert some of that repetitive news structure and give us a different way to understand intimacy within conflict. It sort of backfired. We learned a wonderful lesson because we had 7 video installations. We had 14 artists, 7 video installations, and you got fatigue in the show. Like, even though we were really trying to show work that could cut through that fatigue, video fatigue is real too. So that was our attempt at exploring exactly your question. So my other point, though, what I am interested in is, I think I showed some of my students this, but there's a video by Martine Sims called Notes on Gesture. And let's see, I'll type it into the chat. I'm not positive that you can easily watch the whole thing. I think you can't, but I am positive that you could. Why doesn't the chat come up for me? Oh, there it is. You could see more about it. So I think there is a place also to think about the ways that we learn from repetition in a productive way on social media. And so Sims in this video is thinking about new languages being built, new languages around Black women's gestures, new languages being built and sort of accelerated around ways of communicating that are like instrumental and really important. So, I don't think like repetition is always a bad thing. And I think that repetition in social media also can be a way that we accelerate learning about certain things. Okay, did that answer your question? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the project that I started working on after this. It's not a jump, actually. It came right after that. And I wanted to really finally, oh, sorry, the dog party's trying to enter. No. Think about talking to my very difficult to pin down father specifically about his experiences in World War II. So he's 84. He was like 10 during World War II in London as it was being bombed, and doesn't talk about it at all. But there's certain things that are very apparent, like certain sounds will make him just fall down. Like there's really ways that totally outside of language, it's very clear the effect that had on him. And so I wanted to talk to him about it. And he does not want to talk about it on camera. So I started to think about ways that I could frame a project that didn't just focus on him, but focused on the ways that, well, let me back up a little bit. So he's an actor, and he has played a bunch of small parts on things. And one of the things he played a small part on was a TV show called JAG, which is like a military TV show. It's very cheesy. And he was on it for 8 years. And he was a method actor. And so he lived in character for a lot of the time. And so I thought he was in the military for a lot of the time. So this sort of slippage between where media, TV, and military overlap became the nexus for this project. It's a project that I worked on from like 2016. It's still ongoing, although hopefully done in the next year. And there's 5 parts. Each part deals with someone who overlaps at this intersection between media and military. So my dad is one of them. And then another person is choosing to remain unnamed, but he's an Iraqi American who lived at Fort Irwin in character for 8 years. And Fort Irwin is a military base that is designed to look like Iraq. There's 8 different towns. It's enormous. It's the size of Rhode Island. And so he played the police chief in this town, where soldiers would go to train to get ready to be deployed. So it was like an immersive experience. And so I called the project Out of Play because in these towns, there are rooms that are called Out of Play, where soldiers can go to be out of the simulation for a minute. So this is the set house, the set production house, where the walls and rooms are built for this simulation. And here's a still from the films, a still of my dad getting makeup done. And then this is the installation that I did so the first 4 are done, and they were shown in January of 2020. February of 2020. And they were at the Los Angeles Municipal Gallery, which if you haven't been, I really recommend once we can go places in person. It's at the top of Barnsdall, and it's a very beautiful place to go. So these walls, they donated walls that were too broken to keep using, and I refurbished them and used them as the installation for these 4 videos. So here you can see some of the scale. These walls are enormous. And here's 2 of these different little alcoves, big alcoves. Here's another one. You can see part of the wall is missing. And here's the last one. So I mentioned the one that centers my dad, the one that centers Fort Irwin, another one that centers a combat videographer. So that's a videographer that was trained to shoot by the military. And then the 4th one is dealing with a writer for a military TV show. The 5th one that I haven't finished yet is kind of the like linchpin of the whole thing. Like it's a really crucial part, which is a branch of the military called OCPA, which is the Office of Chief of Public Affairs, that reviews scripts. So people can send their script to this office and say, I want to make this film. I need a tank. And if the script represents the military in a positive light, they will give that production a tank or a jet and the military people to fly it or drive it. So these different ways that these industries intersect is really scary and really interesting to me, because it's a very like normalized form of control. And again, like it you know, when people ask me like, what do I think, you know, art can do, I'm reminded all the time of the potency that so many people recognize that images have, right? Like there's an entire branch of the military devoted to creating positive propaganda about the military in Hollywood. It's a whole branch, right? It's staffed, it's enormous. So I think that sorry, it's not a branch of the military, it's a branch of the army. But I think that it's really, it's been a really wild journey. It's been a really wild journey because I've been granted access to people and places that I didn't expect to have conversations that went totally differently than I expected. The sort of overlying thing that's most interesting to me about all of this is a conversation that I had with the head of redactions. So when a military court case happens, he goes in and redacts what shouldn't be made available to the public. This happens a lot, where something like a big event will happen in the military, there'll be some kind of kerfuffle about it, and these redactions will obfuscate a lot of information. The thing that's super interesting to me is when Hollywood takes up that story and fills in those blanks for us. Zero Dark 30 is an interesting example of this, which dealt with the killing of Osama bin Laden. We don't really know, like all of that is totally classified. We don't actually have any idea how that went down. But we have a film that completely supplanted our cultural imagination about what that was like, right? We have Jessica Chastain standing in there. We have this sense that we know what happened, though we don't know. So I wanted to think like, okay, but what if we slow down and say, well, we don't know. What happens if we hold some space for those gaps, if we listen to those silences, if we start to think about how fast that information gets filled in. Okay, I'm going to show you some stuff. So the first one I want to share is a 2-minute excerpt with my father. So what we did in this section is we, why does that? I can't, I see, there it is. Okay, here you go. So in this section, you'll see a conversation that we are having as he's getting his makeup done. And then, but in the end of this clip, it's each video is about 13 minutes. He performs some of the military transcripts that have been redacted, trying to fill in the blanks as he sees fit or leave space for them, and struggling with how he could think of a transcript as a script. So I'll see you back in 2 minutes. And then I'm gonna give you one more. This one is a whole the whole video. So just watch. It's just just watch 3 minutes. So from 5:06 to 8:10. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far? So in the second video, you heard the role player talking a little bit about this sense of like it almost being play, like a reenactment of his childhood in a way. And in other sections with the one that's about my father, there's also there's sort of parallels that echo from each video to each video in different ways, to think about the ways that these fictional situations do affect, like have really very, very tangible effects on the people that I'm talking to, and also have really tangible effects kind of on all of us, like really affecting our landscape in some very intense ways. And so then you also got to see a little bit of the set house that built the sets as well. Any questions about this? Okay. So another show that opened in 2020 was a show that I curated called Sound Off, Silence and Resistance. And so this was a way, I think, honestly, in some ways, I got tired of working by myself. This project Out of Play has been like depressing, to be totally frank. And I really wanted to be in conversation and in community. And so I started noticing and thinking about artworks that I was seeing out in the world that were taking up the power of silence, taking up silence as a tool that could be used in protest, that could be used as various forms of resistance. So if you think about not snitching, if you think about literal silent protests, if you think about the right to just withhold information, the right to interiority, to really prioritize your own interior space. If you think about the power of listening, there's a lot of different ways that silence can be used as resistance, as active forms of resistance. So the people in the show, Pauline Beaudry, Renata Lorenz, Nikita Gale, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Sharon Hayes, Basira Khan, Camila Janan Rashid, and Elisa Schwartz, all engage that in different ways. And so another part of the show that was important for me was to think about historical silent protests. And here's a couple examples. The suffragettes actually staged a silent protest, I believe, for an entire year outside the White House. I have to double check that information, but a lot of that information, I actually collaborated with two other curators who just worked on the historical research and then presented that in the show as well, because I wanted to think about not only just in the contemporary art sphere, but a way that these strategies were being used on the street as well. And this is documentation of one of the first silent protests held by Black Americans in 1917, I want to say. Here's a couple shots. This is a piece by Sharon Hayes. And this figure who moves around, there's 4 monitors, who moves around, is only listening, is silent all of the time, and only listening to different protests and using their mic as a way to navigate the space. So you only hear what the listener is miking, as a way to really think of that position of listening as a powerful one. This is a sound blanket. So it's an acoustic sound blanket that muffles sound that Basira Khan, you can see actually in this photo, embroidered here and wore to several protests. So thinking about it in relationship to the hijab, in relationship to this form of protection, this kind of cloak of invisibility or protection in a really practical way from tear gas, and also this sense of like an inner sanctuary. And I won't share all of the work with you, but it was a really helpful and powerful way for me to, again, just be in community. And then the project that I'm working on now is finishing oversight and also dealing with some intergenerational non-trauma, some intergenerational joy, because I'm also really tired after the pandemic and I don't want to start working on my project about war and trauma again. So I'm working on a project that deals with 3 different cinematographers and filmmakers from the 30s and 40s who are queer and who work with cinema in very different ways. So Arzner on the left is like very out, but making these very heteronormative films. And then sometimes you get these little glimpses of what she's trying to say or queer or subvert that are really exciting. And then some of these filmmakers, there's another filmmaker that I'm looking at too, are much more kind of explicit in a queer gaze or a queer exploration. And I'm thinking again about what's not spoken. How is their camera movement talking about what can't be talked about? And how can I use my camera movement to kind of like create a bridge to these queer ancestors and see through their camera, since so little is written about them in terms of an archive, so little of their queer history is documented. So what's another sort of lifeline that I can create through my camera? And that is it for me. I would love to hear from you all if you have the energy.
Wow, thank you so much, Abigail.
Thank you.
Let's take some questions. And I can't see all of you, so just jump on in.
How long were you at that base? I don't remember if you gave us much information about that, where it is and how long you were there and how you were able to take all that video there.
I was just there for a day. I talked to the role player like 3 times for a couple hours each, but I just visited him in different places, once in his home in San Diego. So I talked to him extensively, but I was granted access to the base for a day.
And you saw them training and stuff, because they were firing in some of those clips.
Yeah, so they have, again, it's really interesting. They use Hollywood special effects. So they're not firing live ammunition, but they use Hollywood special effects to give the soldiers a sense of like, it is really loud, it's really smoky, but it's like laser tag. It's advanced laser tag. Everyone's wearing a little vest and it says like if you wounded or killed them, but it says it like,
Wild.
Yeah, it's very wild. I think that was a really interesting one for me because I think I walked in with this perspective of like, what a wild situation. And they're like, no, it's a really practical means to an end. This is a very effective way of training. And so in some ways, like, I walked into a lot of situations, like I had an interview at the Pentagon. A lot of situations that I didn't expect to have access to, because from my perspective, this is absolutely mind-blowing bonkers. And from their perspective, this is a really
Their
logical
everyday
through
life.
line.
It's such an interesting world to get to like investigate with this project.
Yeah. Yeah, it has been. It has been really, also, I have to say, like, I've learned again and again and again, like that the relationship between fiction and reality is super slippery, because I often notice I'm performing I'm performing myself bigger or smaller depending on what I think is going to gain me access. So at Fort Irwin, I'm performing myself smaller. I'm like, I have a family member in the military, and I'm just like interested in the base, right? Like I'm nothing to do with a film. My camera is just like documentation. And
Gotcha.
then in other situations, I'm a Hollywood producer. And so like just understanding, but it's interesting because a lot of those things I probably learned from my dad, who was living in character. So that relationship between acting and reality are like such weird amorphous situations in this project. There's also like through each of these forms of access, like every time I'm white, I'm feminine, I'm small, like no one is seeing me as a threat, right? And so all of these biases are something I'm super conscious of, and they're gaining me access at every turn.
You said that you had opinions change or conversations you didn't expect. What were the biggest things that your or opinions that changed after you went in there or got this stuff? I didn't realize you had a family member in the military too. I feel like that makes you more comfortable. Or your grandfather.
Yeah, it makes it really complicated. And I'm interested in that complication. Like I'm not walking in with, it's a hard line, right? Like I want to walk in there with my ethics intact, and I also want to walk in there open to information that I disagree with and to hear it out fully. Otherwise, why make it, right? Like otherwise I'm not learning anything. And so I think one thing I didn't expect, there's a writer for a military TV show, and of all the things that I thought he was going to say they weren't allowed to talk about, like to write about, it was just PTSD. He was like, that is just off the table. They're getting military funding, and it was off the table to talk about PTSD. And I was really surprised because I thought it would be something really relatable. It could really gain an audience in terms of thinking about vets. And it was just 100% off the table. So that was really
reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's not really going to increase recruitment.
Good. Yeah.
This is why I'm tired of this project. It's like the things I was surprised about often were dark.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry. Not sorry, but it is what it is. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just curious, what are the names of the other cinematographers in the photo?
So I have to look, hold on one second. I have it right here. So I have a list actually, I have to find it, of 5. And again, like, some out and some not out. Hold on one second. Let me stop sharing. I may have to send it to you all. I might have to send it to Ty. I'm not actually seeing it right here. But I'm happy to send it to you. I mean, I'm deep in the wormhole, in the like research wormhole. So I'm learning a lot, and more than happy to share all the information.
Yeah, that'd be great. I could give you my email, or if you just
Actually,
want-
let's do that. Yeah, put your email. You can send it to me privately or to everyone, and I will email you that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's also a really great archive in LA called the One Archive through USC. I think it's the only queer archive in Los Angeles.
Abigail, if you have a minute, I don't know, maybe people need to go, but if I guess this is well, I'm interested in how, like, what your journey in art school looked like that sort of led you towards this sort of longer term research based art practice that you have now. I mean, did you start with, were you in painting classes, or did you come at it through a journalistic perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I went to art high school at Loxa, and then I went to undergrad at Cooper Union for art, and then I went to grad school for art. So a lot of art school, but I did do, yeah, a lot of painting. I loved figure drawing and ceramics, and sculpture. I was mostly doing sculpture in undergrad, and then a few friends told me about this video class, mostly because they loved the teacher, and the teacher was Sharon Hayes. And I asked her if I could take her class but make sculpture and not video. And she said no. She said you can make 2 sculptures and 1 video. And I was like, fine. And so I ended up really loving the medium, and I really loved her work and her class. And actually, one of her pieces ended up in the Sound Off exhibition. And I just didn't stop making video after that. So I think it was, and I mean, maybe some of that sculptural part never left also, because I do really enjoy thinking about dealing with the installation sculpturally. But I don't know. It was just that one class. Yeah. And I think her ethos is actually very grounded in listening, if I think about it. As a teacher, as an artist, and I ended up working for her after I graduated as an employer, really, really, really centered around listening. And I think I saw the ability to connect with other people through video, and the possibility to ask questions and really listen through her and through that process. Yeah. Yeah. Teachers.
Well, thank you for being that person, that inspiration to so many students now. I mean, I've talked to so many Pepperdine students who have been, just foundationally changed by working with you. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
On behalf of them, and thank you for me for being part of our art community at Pepperdine. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you all. I mean, I've been also changed by getting to see such like brave student work. It's been wonderful. Thank you all. And if you have any questions that you didn't want to ask publicly, you can also email me. I'm happy to answer as well there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abigail. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.